To the shock and surprise of no one, I don't tend to keep up with modern gaming trends these days, on account of there being too many good old games to play and too many great ways to play them. One that I did spot recently via Twitter was people complaining about games getting remasters that didn't need them. It was one of the Horizon games they were talking about, and I can understand the source of their frustration. I'd feel frustrated if I spent my life complaining about games on Twitter too. It also ties in nicely with what I'm going to talk about today. Something else that isn't shocking is the number of people who fail to understand what diminishing returns are. In economics, diminishing returns is the part where growth slows and then starts to decline. I guess you could say we live in an entire era of diminishing returns. Yay! In graphical terms, there's only so much difference to the naked eye that improvements will bring, with each one being less noticeable either due to player adaptation to it or simply not being that different. The infamous image demonstrating this has been floating around the internet for over a decade now, showing this dapper gentleman rapidly improving with each increase in his triangle mesh, until the jump from 6,000 to 60,000 triangles, at which point the difference is negligible. Shortly afterward, someone else on the internet took issue with this, as always, and eventually a rebuttal picture was posted, completely missing the point of the first image. The simple and stark illustration was replaced with reams of text and a load of arrows. Graphical processing just isn't that easy to understand. You must consider this and that and the other. Nah, it's very easy, it's just like sound. Once you reach a certain fidelity, the differences will be less and less, or require more and more horsepower to demonstrate. Modern-day graphics developers are aware of this, and it's why a lot of the more recent remasters are essentially the same games but with bundled DLC and new effects plastered on top. Bump mapping, parallax mapping, and more fluid animations now receive more attention than how high the polygon count is. And as any budding modder who has heard of effects injection will tell you, the lighting makes the biggest difference of all. The form of lighting that has received the most press attention lately has been Nvidia's RTX, a type of ray tracing. Ray tracing creates an image by casting its rays through pixels of an image plane, simulating the effects of its encounters with visual objects. The result of this is more natural lighting and realistic shadows akin to the modern world, rather than the static or gamified effects of before. Recently, they went and demonstrated this, combined with AI upscaling and recalculating of maps and meshes, on a game from 2002, Morrowind. Yeah, that's a huge difference. But it's comparing 20 years of improvements to the base game, which was limited by the technology of the time and not necessarily the vision of the art team. Go search for any upscale of Morrowind or OpenMW or Community Replacement Pack and you'll see what it's capable of. It's also worth mentioning that just because you can doesn't mean you should. Quake 2 got an RTX update and yeah, they completely destroyed the atmosphere of the original. Did you watch Ross Scott's latest video about trick style? It looks like a pretty neat hoverboard game from the mid to late 2000s. It's not. It's a PC port of a Dreamcast launch title from the 90s, complete with uncapped frame rate, distance, and graphical fixes and a widescreen hack. With those graphical improvements and technical additions from the community, the game looks almost 10 years younger than it is, and anyone could pick it up and play it, and that's without AI involved in upscaling anything. Those are the original assets. What about this one? Is this the latest Formula 1 game from EA? Nope. That's Jeff Cramman's Formula 1 Grand Prix 4 from 2002. Here it is side by side with F1 19 without as many effects, and the difference is negligible. The community modifications and injected effects combined with the uncapped frames means that it can compete with games 20 years newer than it, and still be better, because it's a better simulation of the motorsport. If you're feeling really adventurous, check out the TIE Fighter Total Conversion and the Free Space Source Code project to discover why two engines from the late 90s are still the definitive space combat simulators of choice. And that's the big problem that modern games face. They'll look a bit better in some aspects to their predecessors, but once those technical barriers are removed, the older games look almost as good and play a far better game. because their priorities were making the player have fun, because they valued the player's money and time. There's a baseline of visual acceptability that varies from player to player, and games companies have discovered that not only are there diminishing returns graphically, but also diminishing returns with a crop of gamers who need the shiniest new thing. The number of people who can run a full VR gaming setup is a small slice of the populace, several million at the time of this video's publication. That's supposed to increase exponentially as the prices come down in the ensuing years, but for now, of 120 million people using Valve's Steam platform, only 2.3% of that number were using virtual reality. These are the trend embracers, the whales, the people who can afford to purchase the latest technology and try it out. And because the technology is always more expensive, those few can catapult something like Valve's Index to the top of the sales chart, because 2% purchasing a £1,000 item is more profitable than 98% buying indie shovelware. The point is that we've been playing games roughly the same way for decades now, and the time when you could rely on graphical improvements to mask boring gameplay is coming to an end. The rise of the terribly named boomer shooter genre, the embracing of pixelization with console retroism, the definitive hyper super mega deluxe remasterings and endless community modifications for games, and titles like Animal Crossing and Terraria being some of the best selling in recent history all point to the same thing. That baseline I talked about with regards to what players will tolerate is actually quite low. So long as the gameplay is accessible and the technological requirements are adhered to, the graphics actually don't matter that much. id Software went from Hovertank 3D to Quake in 5 years. 3 years after that, id Tech 3 was released alongside Quake 3 competing against the Unreal Engine. Those two engines were the base, the very foundation for a huge chunk of the modern games you play today, including Source and the Infinity Engine, which powers most Valve and Call of Duty games respectively. All the graphical groundwork has been done, and for decades we've had people essentially making it a little bit prettier with post-processing but precious little else. And it's not just 3D games either, as I've harped on about in the past. If you were to take DOS games and plant them into a more modern engine with better frame rates and graphical effects, and remastered or upscaled assets and better controls, while keeping the actual game the same, they would be universally lauded. I know this because it has happened and continues to happen. Look at Open Transport Tycoon Deluxe or Open XCOM or the Urk 1 Masters HD. The era of the prettiest game being the one to play has stalled in the wake of diminishing graphical returns and slow VR adoption. A schism will begin to form between those who go into virtual reality and forsake the simple 2 dimensions of the past, and those whose genres or proclivities just don't suit it. I think you can guess which side of the fence I fall on. Back to playing DOS games. And if you like me talking about old games, boy have I got a channel for you. There's no diminishing returns here, hundreds of videos about the topic. Feel free to take a look, and if you like what you see you can always subscribe. Until next time.